Generally speaking, laughing at other people's failures is considered unbecoming. However, laughing at the failure of an arrogant, money-hungry corporation, well, that's something most of us can get on board with. And we have a great death-related one to share with you today. The SCI attempted takeover of the Australian funeral industry back in the 90s, which went even worse than Starbucks' attempted takeover of the Aussie coffee scene, which failed for many of the same reasons. And fellow Aussies watching will know that we love to bring that one up. This is a case that should be taught in business schools everywhere as a what not to do. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk SCI's failure in Oz. Who is SCI? SCI stands for Service Corporation International. I'm sure there is a business reason for the name being so vague, but I couldn't find a concrete explanation. Also, the international part is quite a stretch. Anyways, to quote their website, Service Corporation International is proud to be North America's leading provider of funeral, cremation, and cemetery services. Since 1962, CSI has been serving families during their most difficult, personal, and challenging times. Today, we are the company that more than 600,000 families turn to each year for compassionate and professional care. Now, this company is massive. Today, it operates more than 1,500 funeral homes and 400 cemeteries. In 2013, it purchased Stewart Enterprises, the second largest death care company. It is currently estimated that their share of the total funeral and cemetery market in North America is around 15%. Their market share is particularly strong in the cemetery services, where they control an estimated 27.6% of the industry. They have fallen off over the years. So where were they back in the 90s? The 1990s was a time of plenty for SCI. They were riding high, they were on top, they were confident, money was pouring in. Founder Robert Waltrip decided now was the time to implement his vision. And what was his vision? To McDonaldize the funeral industry, standardizing services, consolidating ownership, and streamlining operations. He saw funerals as a fragmented industry, ripe for corporate consolidation, much like what happened with sectors like hospitality and fast food. Which now makes me wonder if he had anything to do with those drive-through funeral homes that we spoke about a while back. SCI had already grown rapidly across the United States. Waltrip and his executives believed that the model could scale internationally, assuming that funeral services would follow similar business patterns across countries. And boy, were they wrong. So let's fly back to Australia. Australia's funeral industry in the 90s. The Australian funeral industry in the 90s comprised of locally owned businesses competing against each other. This was an entrenched aspect of the Australian way of death. Funeral homes were largely local, family-run and community-focused, operating on trust, long-standing relationships and regional reputation. Funeral directors weren't just service providers, they were often seen as pillars of the community. Many provided informal emotional support, knew clients personally, and tailored services to local religious and cultural customs. There was a strong emphasis on personalised care rather than the standardised packages we see today. While still businesses, the industry was less aggressively profit-driven than the US was at the time. There wasn't a culture of upselling or high-pressure sales tactics. Most funeral homes didn't advertise heavily because reputation was everything and advertising was seen as inappropriate. So that's what the SCI wanted to take over. The takeover. In 1993, SCI turned up on Aussie shores and immediately started to buy up everything they could get their hands on, particularly in the main cities. Funeral homes, cemeteries, crematoriums, which were very new at the time, they wanted it all. In just a few years, they held 22% market share. But why were they able to do it? Well, naivety on the part of Aussies at the time, really. SCI was the first big player to try this kind of aggressive consolidation in Australia. Because of this, there were few barriers to foreign ownership in the funeral sector at the time. No national body oversaw funeral business consolidation, and regulations varied by state. This lack of oversight made it easy for SCI to quietly and quickly acquire multiple properties. They came in cashed up, offering generous buyouts to independent funeral home owners, many of whom had never seen that kind of money before. These offers were especially tempting for aging owners who had no clear succession plan or were ready to retire. SCI promised they'd keep the family feel while taking over the business side, which many sellers liked the idea of. It was a complete lie, but it worked. SCI often kept the original names of businesses it bought, maintaining the illusion of independence. This allowed them to build a portfolio quietly before the public or media really noticed. This meant many families had no idea that the funeral home they had been using for years had been sold to a US corporation. SCI presented themselves as modernizers, bringing professionalism, technology, and efficiency to a dated industry. They promised better resources, streamlined operations, and nationwide consistency. And for some independent owners, this felt like a step up. SCI had managed to convince them that the way they did it was old, dated, and inefficient. There is a reason the US is known for its aggressive sales tactics. But what SCI didn't fully account for was just how tight-knit and emotionally driven the Australian funeral industry really was. And once word got out, the community and media backlash was fast and strong. Business 101. For those of you who have never done a business course, one of the first things that they will drill into you is that in order to be successful, you need to know your target market, and you need to know them really well. What do they want? What do they need? What can they spend? What are they willing to spend? Etc., etc. To be a successful business, you need to spend time researching your target audience. SCI did not. At all. And considering how spectacularly it went wrong, I wouldn't be surprised if they thought they'd landed in Austria rather than Australia. Rather, they simply made assumptions. SCI assumed that cost, convenience, and consistency, the pillars of their US success, would appeal to Australian consumers. But Australians valued empathy, community trust, and personal services far more than the polished corporate offerings. SCI treated the funeral service like a product. Australians saw it as a relationship, which means they ignored the basic business rule of know what your customers value and why they buy from you in the first place. Then, SCI decided to keep the local business names after acquiring funeral homes, but over time, changes to service, staffing, and pricing revealed the corporate presence. Families felt betrayed when they discovered that their trusted local funeral director was now owned by a foreign corporation, and they were not getting that trust back. A brand's trust isn't just a name, it's built on consistent, culturally aligned services. Furthermore, they assumed culture was the same everywhere. SCI applied an American business model to a non-American emotional experience, assuming death and grief were handled similarly across all cultures. The US model included bundled packages, upselling, and efficiency-focused operations which clashed with the Australian expectation of modesty, sincerity, and personalization of grief rituals. The basic business idea that you tailor your model to the local culture seems to have completely eluded them, in the same way that Australia's coffee culture seemed to have done Starbucks in years later. And it wasn't just the buyouts. SCI expanded aggressively and fast, with little visible effort to consult with communities or understand regional preferences. They failed to build grassroots relationships with the same care that independent funeral homes had spent decades nurturing. Again, market research isn't optional, it's survival, which is why the Crocs ate them. Australian death care at the time was an industry based on trust, dignity, and integrity. Public perception was everything. And as soon as the media exposed SCI's growing ownership, the public began to associate them with profit over compassion. The funeral homes they had acquired lost business simply due to the SCI's association. And once the media hates you, well, it's all over. SCI and founder Robert Waltrip completely forgot what death care and the funeral industry was supposed to be about. On SCI's website, they call Waltrip a visionary, and who knows, maybe he was and he'd just been smoking a lot of pot that year, I don't know. But the company tried to turn pain into money. That was their first mistake. Their second was to try and Americanize a country's most personalized industry, believing that they knew best. The retreat. In early 2001, less than a decade after they showed up, they disappeared. It was as if a moving van had shown up in the middle of the night to your annoying neighbor's house, quietly packed up, drove off, leaving an empty house the next morning. I mean, you're happy they're gone, but at the same time, you're asking yourself, what the hell just happened? I like to imagine SCI's accounting team spanking the butts of SCI's executive team, because by the late 1990s, SCI was drowning in debt. Due to aggressive international acquisitions, and not just in Australia, they tried this foolishness in many other countries too. Overpaying for funeral homes in markets they didn't fully understand, and operational losses from poor integration and consumer pushback, they were bleeding money and investors were getting nervous. Back home, SCI's stock was tanking. Its global empire was overextended and not delivering returns. Wall Street started demanding a refocus on core operations. The Australian division was seen as a failed experiment and one of the first parts of the business to be trimmed. By 1999, SCI had to write down more than $1 billion in losses from failed global acquisitions. Between $30 to $50 billion of that was from the attempt in Australia. SCI didn't make a big public statement about leaving Australia. That would have confirmed their failure of global ambitions. Instead, they just quietly pulled out, closed offices, and transferred ownership. The aftermath. Rather than a dramatic public exit, SCI sold its Australian assets quietly. Many of the funeral homes and cemeteries SCI had acquired were sold to a then emerging player, InvoCare. Or rather, SCIA was sold in 2001 to a consortium led by a subsidiary of the Macquarie Bank, which then 2 years later floated its cash cow on the Australian Stock Exchange as InvoCare. Selling them back to independent owners was just not a possibility for them, as it would have taken an extremely long time. They didn't have the money, and at that point there wouldn't have been enough buyers. InvoCare learned from SCI's mistakes, maintaining local branding, being more culturally sensitive, and operating with less visibility as a corporate giant. InvoCare now directs the funerals of 1 in 5 Australians. So would we have had InvoCare now if SCI hadn't decided to come over and raid our funeral industry back in the 90s? It's hard to say. While young people are coming back to the funeral industry now, they weren't back then, and like we said, aging funeral home owners back then needed a way out. But that was a bit over 30 years ago. It's likely that InvoCare or another large corporation would have very slowly found its way to being the funeral overlord that it is now. But it would have been much slower and more considered. It is likely that without SCI's interference, today's public would have had more trust in the funeral industry than they do today. But in saying that, most Aussies aren't even aware that SCI was even here. They did a lot of damage, but the time that they were here was really a blip on the radar, and no one talks about death here anyway. And if you want to know more about the mega giant that is InvoCare, go and check out our video on it. It wasn't only Australia where SCI tried and failed. In the 90s, they were feeling so confident that they attempted to push their way into 18 other countries across 4 continents. They failed quickly in all of them, for the same reason they failed in Australia. They didn't bother to learn about their market. My favourite line on their website is where they describe in their history, "In 2000 we reassessed our long-term strategy and streamlined our operations and organisational structure to lower expenses, reduce debt and increase cash flow." It's a nice corporate way of saying, yeah, we effed up. Which is why I say this is such a great lesson in business. And with that, go talk death.